Hello students, and welcome to our next class in the Principles and Practice of Management. Today we'll be introducing the third topic where we'll be talking about the most basic managerial function, which is the planning function. Remember, we have different functions that management has to carry out, and the most basic and the most original one that has to be done is the planning function. Now, what do we understand by the planning function? We say this is the basic process of setting goals and determining how to achieve them. So planning is how you set goals, and how you plan to achieve them. Now, as a manager, remember we are doing this course to become managers. So as a manager, you need to be able to see into the future, or to have a place that you expect or you want to be, and the place that you are, and now you find ways to get to that place. And how do you do this? First, you need to set those goals. If your company, maybe the goal is to have a higher number of profit, a lower cost, to produce more, and so on, you usually use this to do that. So we have different types of plans. We usually have strategic plans. Now the strategic plans are usually set by the top level management, okay? And strategic plans usually take a larger time frame or a larger span, where, for example, the directors of a company may decide, we want this business, we want this company, we want it to be able to run, we want it by after 5 years, we want something out of it. That's what usually we have as the strategic plans. Another thing that you must understand about these plans, they usually have a large scope. So these are the decisions. These plans are the ones that are made for the whole company, where they do not have a specific department that they want something. Maybe they say in the next 3 years you want this company to be international in these different countries and so on and so forth. Then you have the tactical plans, okay? Now these tactical plans are the medium and short range that are done by the mid-level management, okay? Here you have the branch managers, you have the different managers, the departmental managers, okay? These are the ones that come with the tactical plans. These are the plans that are usually used to deal with specific resources or time constraints. Where, for example, the manager notices that we need a specific thing at this particular period of time. Where you're planning for the next 2 weeks, for the next 1 month. That's what we usually talk about, the tactical plans. Then finally, you have the operational plans. Now these are the plans that are set on a day-to-day basis. Now we usually have different types of operational plans. We have the standing plans and the single-use plans. The standing plans are also called the stand-alone plans. And the single-use plans are the things you may think about, such as budgets. When you come up with a budget, these are plan of how you spend money at a specific period of time for specific reasons that you want to use. So we've talked about the standing plans and the single-use plans. Now, the standing plans, these maybe are the ones that talk about how a routine will be carried out, okay? You see, a routine is a plan that you've decided, for example, a timetable. That's what you mean by a standing plan. A single-use plan is something like a budget that will be used once and cannot be used on another day. So, another thing that we'll look at when you're trying to discuss planning, or the planning function, remember you said this is the basic function of a manager. And you say is usually the time frame of planning. So you have different time frames for planning. You usually have the long range, the intermediate, and the short range. I think they are rather self-explanatory, although now this one usually talks about maybe around 5 years. That's usually the long range. Where you want, a good thing is to ask yourself is, because most of you will go and start getting a job, and they'll ask you, where do you see yourself in 5 years? They want to know how well your long range planning is, because someone that does not plan for things is actually planning to fail. I think you've ever heard of that. Failing to plan is actually planning to fail. So the long range plan, and how do you usually answer that question? Maybe for for other use is that usually answer that question by seeing yourself still in that same company. You don't start talking about things that are not in that company. So when you ask maybe in an interview, what is your plan in the next 5 years? You talk about yourself in that company. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Let's talk about the intermediate planning. This is now a period of maybe, let's say, 1 to 5 years. 1 to 5 years. Here's where you're planning for things. You're planning for things that are that will be used within 1 to 5 years. And finally, short-range planning is planning for less than a year. So less than 1 year. When you're deciding what will you do during that 1 year. So these are for the things that will be done within a specific year. Now a company has to make all these decisions to know how well and how far they want to be in the market. Now there are different processes that are required in the planning process. You see, planning is not something that you just wake up and do. It has to be very well categorized, very well curtailed to make sure that your plans zisigonge mwamba. You don't want your plans to get to rock bottom, whereby for you to be able to get out of that point becomes a rather identical issue. So anyway, so you're saying planning is not random and it has to follow a certain levels of guidelines. Now the steps in the planning process, these are questions that always comes after every 1 or 2 years. There has to be a question that asks the students to talk about the planning process. And why? Because I'm telling you, the principles of management is rather important because it prepares you for the later life. You don't just learn this for the sake of classwork and exam work, but to know what to do. So the first step is the identification of opportunities. And at this point, you look at future possible opportunities that will come up. You've noticed that at the current market, there's this thing that is happening. That means in the future, you are expecting something to happen. So that's the first part, where you're drawing out an ideal future and then seeing what opportunities will exist in that future time. Then you establish your objectives. At this point, you decide, okay, after the first part I've said, I've had this there. These are the future that would rather be supposed to happen. And then these are the opportunities that I want. So what are the objectives now that you know how the environment, the future will be? Do you want to make profits? Do you want to improve production? Do you want to sell more? Do you want to reduce costs? And so on. So that's usually the second part of the planning process. Then on the third part, you talk about, you consider the planning premises. Now, when you're looking at the planning premises, you want to know, do we use the long range, intermediate, and or the short range? Because remember, like we said, the short range is broken down into all of this. So you have to know, is this feature that you are thinking about in the intermediate range, in the short term range, or in the long term range? Okay? Then you have to determine alternative courses. What most people usually make a problem of when they are planning is not having alternative courses. If, for example, you have an ideal situation in the future, always have different ways of getting there. If, for example, you are at point A and you want to get to point B, let's say you want to get to point Z, okay? So this is your future. This is the ideal future that you have, and this is your ideal, this is the present that you are at, okay? So, of course, most people prefer just the direct route, but what you usually realize is that when you start leaving this point A, on this line you'll come and realize, wait, there are a number of obstacles that are here, so you have to go around. Now, most people usually lose their sense of direction when they realize the place I'm supposed to be going is this side. Why am I going upwards? the reason you go upwards and change direction is so that you can be able to get to that place, avoiding all these obstacles, because they'll always be there. Obstacles will always be there in your planning process as a manager. So you have to determine alternative courses to get to that place. Then you have to evaluate the alternatives. Another way of crossing this barrier is just cutting through it. Okay? For example, this barrier, if our organization wants in the next 5 years to be able to access markets in Tanzania, and maybe this barrier is that Kenya has a problem doing business with Tanzania, you may decide to not think about those problems and just cut across them, or you may decide to go around by following the rules that are laid down. So you have to evaluate the alternatives that you came up, then you select one course of action. So you've realized our company is in Kenya, we want to expand it to Tanzania. What do? Do we go through the rules and regulations, or do we just circumvent or go around the rules and regulations? Then you have to select, okay, you've selected the course. Then you have to formulate derivative plans. I think it's good to talk about those derivative plans. Our long-range plan was from Kenya to Tanzania. Our short-range plan is to make sure you already know what is expected, how the company has to keep growing at the time it is already in Kenya, so that its resources can be transferred to the other country. So you have to have those derivatives. Those in big, small, get you there. Finally, you have the numberize the plans by budgeting. You want to make sure that you've numberized your plans. Then the barriers to planning are environmental, poor goal setting, resistance to change, and other constraints. So these are actually the barriers to planning, and you have to be able to beat those barriers. That's all for today. Let's meet next week and continue. Thank you.